He was very decisive, and he was a little intimidating. He would sit behind his desk. He had a large desk, and he'd look down at you. He had half glasses, you know, reading glasses that sat at the end of his nose, so if you walked in there and he'd been reading, and he was a tall, good-looking gentleman, so he'd look down at you across this large desk over these glasses, so he was a little intimidating. I don't think he really meant to be, because he was very nice, but he was a little reserved, so that's how he would come across. He was more of a reserved personality. But he did have a sense of humor. And in those days, many of the curators taught. And what was so wonderful, and Sherman was example numero uno, they were very geared to objects, not theory, objects. And so I had him for the history of Asian art. He wrote the textbook, which is a huge fat tome, and it was excellent. And he was a wonderful teacher because his life revolved around objects, which is what art history is really about. So he would take the class into the galleries often and speak in front of objects. And you could tell how much he loved the objects. Of course, he had chosen many of them, but you really understood that's where it's at. It all begins with the object. Yuji Abe, who owns Yosaido Gallery in Tokyo, it still exists. He's still trucking along. He sells modern or 20th century Japanese prints. He also came and he would restore Japanese screens. So Yuji usually came once a year, every other year. And he and Sherman were great friends. They were both trout fishermen. And so they, went fishing every year. And Yuji would bring prints with him, which we all bought for ourselves personally because they were very reasonable and very lovely. And, of course, we would buy them for the museum. And the man who was the chief designer for probably 42 years or something like that, Bill Ward, he also bought these wonderful modern Japanese prints. And then Bill gave us, over many years, his entire collection, and they all came from Yuji. And in fact, Bill, many years ago, started a fund, and every year would give me money for this endowment, the endowment fund, which is to buy modern Japanese prints. Bill died a few years ago, sadly. He had retired many years before that. But every year he would come in, even after he retired, and he and I together would decide how to spend the interest on his fund. And of course, I am still using that and think about him fondly. So Bill really designed for Sherman, all the signage, picked out all the colors for the galleries, and his favorite color was Battleship Gray. But anyway, Yuji did come a few years ago, here again, and I was in Tokyo 4 years ago and for the first time, went to the gallery myself, which was really a treat, and spent hours there looking through all the drawers, and which resulted in the museum using Bill Ward's the interest that year to buy 4 more prints from Yuji Abe. And when Sherman retired, we had a guard here who had owned a fantastic Hungarian pastry shop on Buckeye. Cleveland has, after Budapest, is the city with the second largest Hungarian population anywhere. So there was the area around Buckeye Road, which is near Shaker Square, was the original Hungarian community here. And this gentleman owned a bakery. And he finally retired from that, and he became a guard here. And for a special occasion, you could order from him some fabulous cake he'd make in his apartment, whatever. So when Sherman retired, he made the most incredible cake, the top of which was a 3-dimensional leaping trout. And we also have a wonderful Winslow Homer watercolor, magnificent, purchased under Sherman. Louise Richards would have chosen it, of a leaping trout. So Sherman left his trout legacy here in the form of this great Homer watercolor.